Thanks, Taj. Appreciate it. So we all put a lot on the table, and the orientation for this session, and Hahrie, I appreciate you kicking us off with kind of grounding in some of your experiences, is really based upon what some of our participants have also asked questions about, which is kind of taking what are a lot of frameworks, a lot of definitions, a lot of different ways that people are already working together, relationships that are getting built, and really grounding it in the practical of what is working, what is not working, what is the hard stuff in between, how to take really a vision that the community holds and drives and leading to action. I think we all are sitting here in this virtual room with really a lot of shared values. I don't think that we have differing values in terms of what we want. We talked about self-determination, talked about letting the community drive, really organizing and base building being at the center. And so I think we're there, which is really exciting. At the end of the first day of a workshop, we're aligned on values, which is great. So the question really is, what are some of the practical ways in which people can start to work together? One of the questions we got is there are a lot of multi-sector collaborations out there, lots of collaborative work between researchers and the grassroots organizing sector, community participatory research. There's lots of partnerships across sectors, and yet not all of them are necessarily working to advance and center organizing and base building, and not all of them are working in concert with each other across multi-sector collaborations. So one of the questions that I'm curious if, Hahrie, maybe you can kick us off. You can also reflect on some of the various things that folks have shared here in their reflection. Just curious if you could share an example of practically how you go about building relationships with grassroots organizations. What do you do? How do you do it? And feel free to use an example of your existing work.
Sure, I can give I'll give a story that I think can be a little bit brief, or I'll try to be brief. So there's a national network of faith-based community organizing groups called Faith in Action. It used to be called PICO. And there was a woman who was their campaigns director for a few years named Joy Cushman. And before she was a campaigns director at PICO, she had worked at the New Organizing Institute, which was an organization that tried to support community power building across the United States. And I knew her from some work that we had done together at the New Organizing Institute where, which is a pretty typical thing, like they had gotten a grant, they needed someone to help. The funder told them they needed to do an evaluator. She called me up, I'm a professor, and she asked me if I'd be the evaluator on it, And we did a little study and we kind of found some results that sort of show the impact of what they were doing. And that was great. And we learned a lot from that initial partnership. But I think both of us left that partnership feeling like we didn't really quite learn as much as we could have because we were doing it in this kind of artificial way that was constructed by a funder. And so when she moved to Faith in Action, as she was building out her work there, early on, she said, Hahrie, can you, and it's other scholar named Paul Spear, who I think is on the agenda at some point, can you and Paul come and co-chair a research council that sits within Faith in Action and that works in partnership with our organizers and our federation leaders to create a shared learning agenda? And so we did that. And I remember I was in California at the time and we flew to DC and met in this dingy little Holiday Inn and sat there for 8 hours trying to figure out what's the shared learning agenda. And we had to do that a couple times. Probably we had discussions for over a year before we figured out what that shared learning agenda was. And the shared learning agenda was one where first it was getting alignment around values, which wasn't that hard, but it still takes some time and building trust between the team, but then second, it was also, what are the questions that the organizers are grappling with that we as scholars also want to really understand? How are we advanced? Because that's when you're really advancing learning on both things. And so it took a year of conversation to do that. And the real turning point for us came when we realized that the work that we're trying to do is trying to challenge some fundamental assumptions that structure the way in which the political establishment is set up. So this kind of gets to some of the idea of the narrative power and the cultural power that Taj and Julia. So if, for example, we think that communities of color cannot be organized, then we set up an entire electoral system that's set up to kind of leave them out, right? Or that's set up to not reach them, right? If we think that low-income people can't be turned out, then we set up our entire system to do that. And so part of what we were doing was we realized we're not just trying to tweak tweak the edges of like how you optimize voter turnout or something like that. But we're trying to challenge these fundamental assumptions about like, can you get low income people to turn out? Can you get communities of color to turn out? And so that, like, realizing that what the research that we're trying to do is about what are the fundamental assumptions that structure power in our society that we want to challenge, that became the guiding light for the way we structured our questions. And then once we had the question, then it was just a matter of figuring out how you set up the research around it. But it was a combination of both building that buy-in and kind of getting to the point where we could articulate 4 assumptions that we wanted to challenge or query through the research that we were doing.
That's great. I want to build off of that. And, you know, Julie and Ethan, we have some funders among our participants. And I know that, you know, as I'm here at the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, I really don't think any of us grow up to be program officers or desire to be kind of senior program officers or finance staff in foundations. So we'd love to hear a little bit about how you got to where you are. And then similarly, building off of what Hahrie sharing, given that there are lots of different ideas, really great interest in seeding research, new collaborations to build power building organizations themselves that have ideas, how do you go about sifting through and developing a strategy that also then helps to align and build off of the vision of the foundations that you work for?
Well, I can start try and be brief too, Aditi, that I came to this work because after I left, I was in the Obama administration at the Justice Department working on a lot of the voting rights and election stuff. And when I left, I went to an advocacy program within a foundation. So I went to the Open Society Foundations where they have an advocacy program. And so I was essentially kind of like an advisor to their grantees about how to do advocacy strategy, because that's what I knew how to do. And then it quickly became clear to me that money and how you structure grant making, and particularly around learning, is such a powerful thing. That it's very powerful that how one does grant making once I got into this whole building power, you know, organizing, how you do it is as important as whether you do it. Because there is a lot, as Hahrie, you were just kind of indicating, there's a lot of funder driven work that is somewhat disconnected from the questions that organizers have. And then you can run an experiment, you can do a project, but you're not really advancing the ball in a meaningful way. But it gives the funders a lot of control, which sometimes funders are interested in control. And so it gives them a lot of control, but you're not really building the learning that your grantees want. But the grantees aren't going to tell you that unless you're in deep relationship with them. They're not going to tell you that because they need money. So this kind of gets to like your question about how to sift through ideas to figure stuff out. I really think that being effective at grant making in this space is just like organizing. It's about relationships. And it's about actually, as this person who's a grant maker, getting into relationship with base building organizations, meaning like talking to them on the phone, you know, Zooming with them, going to meetings where they attend, listening a lot about what they need and how they operate. And then also getting in relationships with people smarter than me who know this field to understand, what do you know, Ethan? What do you know, Hahrie? What do you know? And then to be genuine, it's hard. Because when you're a funder, like you've got the money, right? But it's hard. But to really think, am I co-creating this? So when we set up the Democracy and Power Innovation Fund, this pooled fund that I talked about, we were very clear that we wanted to work with groups that we were already in relationship. One of us was already in relationship with. We can open to meeting new groups. We're always going to be adding or whatever. But then we're going to sit down with them and say, what do you want to learn? Not what do I want to learn, but what's your big question? And then, okay, maybe I know a researcher who could do that with you. Could you do that with them? And again, I keep saying it, but it's really hard because you're used to driving. Organizers are drivers, funders are drivers. I'm a lobbyist. I'm a total driver. I'm trying to get you to there, right? That's where I'm trying to get you. But you have to check yourself and walk with humility. Because when I talk to folks in the organizing community, I have never been more inspired in my life than in a call with I could name one of 20 groups. They know what they want, they know what the problem is, and they know they're in a system where they're devalued. So it's relationships like everything, I think.
Thanks, Julie.
I'll be quick, keeping an eye on the clock. There are a lot of dilemmas involved in trying to use private capital to build public power. I don't think we have enough time to get into all of those today, but the quick things that I'd offer, I think this is one way that Hahrie has put it in some of the research that we've done together, some of the learnings, the internal design choices that leaders make about how to structure their resources, how to structure their people power, refract out to shape power outcomes in the real world. And so that's something, that's instructive for us in our grant making, because, we're sort of wading through this big nonprofit industrial complex where, not all organizing is the same. And, we're sort of trading, and our primary resources is private capital. So, we want to talk with leaders and organizations about who their leaders are and what, how they practice accountability to their leaders, and how they sort of show up in the organization, in the data that they're tracking, in the learning that they're doing. Are people really the primary source of their power, or is it these other resources? And I think that's not always a foregone conclusion. And then I think the other, good piece of advice or rule of thumb for us is like scale is also not impact. You can sort of look at like all these big volume of outputs and activities, but you can do a lot more with 5 committed leaders than you can with 1 million contacts, as a lot of social movements have shown. So those are just a couple things.
Great. Well, we do only have a few minutes left, but I'm realizing that there are a few principles that I think you all have shared where we have a lot of alignment. One is on shared learning, just the real priority to lean in on shared learning rather than on outcomes-driven, policy-driven kind of conclusions. Second, that it really is about shared relationships and taking the time to connect. That power is really part of coming through by building relationships and the time that it takes to do that. I think we've heard that in other sessions too today. And that despite the various frameworks and different definitions, that there are some core elements to power building that you all hold true that include grounding it in everyday people, a base, organizing, these concepts that really are diverse across a set of organizations in the way that they happen, but that if that is at the center, then that is where then all of you who support organizing are trying to figure out how you are in right relationship to organizing and base building. And so I'm curious, Taj and Mimi, to kind of bring us home, if you would be willing to share a little bit about your final thoughts on what, as people are sitting with what you all have shared, which is a lot of rich information, what is the one thing that you would want people to take away? And we can, after you two share, Ethan, Hahrie, Julie, would love your final thought too. What is the one takeaway you want people to leave with as folks who are new to organizing, new to power building, if they're going to approach and try to explore ways of building relationships with this sector, what would you want them to do first? And what would you want them to take away in terms of how they go about building those relationships and engaging in shared learning? Taj, do you want to go first?
Sure. Yeah. I think the thing I would say is, it's important to think about things holistically and to think about power holistically and to think about communities holistically, because one of the biggest barriers in terms of how communities relate to philanthropic institutions is our institutions are very segmented and siloed, and life in community is whole and integrated. And I think in that disconnect, there's a lot of harm and violence that actually happens in the relationship, even when we have the best of intentions. So where I find the most powerful and transformative work happening, it's when, even if we're starting in a silo, we're interested in adolescent health between, we have a focus, but to solve that problem, we have to think holistically, and we have to kind of work with the community holistically. And in the context of that, as was mentioned, there's as sort of you talked about, alluded to, Ethan, philanthropy needs to get serious about economic power, because a grant is not reparations. If we want to go into that conversation right now, we have to think about like transferring assets to communities in ways that put the power of philanthropy into the hands of community. Because if we want to see a different set of health outcomes, that's the kind of power transfer that's going to make the things possible that we often try to accomplish through our grant making, but it's really impossible without a direct building and transfer of economic power within communities, because you can't leave that part of the power equation out. And so I think that's the thing I'll leave with and pass to you, to Mimi, to build and wrap us up.
I mean, to build on that, thank you, Taj, for just going there and taking that leap, which is, to me, to be really honest, I think getting into this moment is just, it requires fundamentally getting out of our silos and really figuring out how to be innovative in taking advantage of collapsed systems. Like, this is actually a moment when we really, yes, wealth is completely consolidated, and there's all these very real dangers, not to be naive, but there's also, because of the complete collapse of systems, climate, economic, health, government, this is a really ripe opening for new things to be built. And so I think when I think about like the audience of amazing folks that this conference gathers, like health, philanthropy, like cutting edge folks in their fields, and people who come to forums like this are already bought in. I think we just have to like do the one-on-one relationship building and actually have some bold gatherings where we can cross the different fields and really do some hackathons on like, what is it that we need to be replacing the current systems with? And so to me, it's, I think just getting out of our job titles and our fields and saying, holistically putting our neighbors at the center. What would we design and redesign, and how can I best leverage my assets and my positional power in all the different ways that folks here have. And I guess I'm excited to just really think about like, how do we create laboratories that are not just in fiefdoms in certain fields, but actually across different stakeholders. And I think the people in this session are very uniquely positioned to do that. So I'm excited to do that in this next. And really, things will start calcifying, and if we have a window, I think, of the next 4 years to really take a leap.
Great, thank you. So I'm just going to ask Hahrie, Ethan, and Julie, since we don't have a lot of time, we're a little bit over, if you could share one word or one phrase exactly to the same point that Taj and Mimi have responded to, which is, what's the one takeaway about how to go about partnering with and supporting grassroots power building? What would you share as a final thought? Julie, you want to go first?
Sure. I'll say walk with humility.
Thanks. Ethan?
Relationships.
And Hahrie?
I'm annoyed that Julie and Ethan took mine. So I'll say, enter into relationship with authenticity.
Great. Well, thank you so much. What a rich conversation, and obviously so much to chew on and digest. Thank you, Hahrie, Ethan, Julie, Mimi, Taj, for sharing your wisdom. And thank you to all of you for joining us today. I invite you to join us again tomorrow for the remaining 2 sessions of the workshop. The morning session will feature 5 examples of community-led initiatives, and the afternoon session will feature examples of projects that establish the evidence base that links community power with health equity. Thanks so much. Have a really good afternoon.